Our next guest is Marit Hughes, Specialist Master. We're going to be talking about FinOps culture. If security is job 0, then FinOps is job 0.5. Wait, is that correct math? I'm not sure, but we're going to be talking about Marit about it. And she's a self-described AWS billing geek. I don't think it's self-described. I think Marit is well known in the AWS and outside the community on billing. In fact, to me, she is a specialist at it. Maybe that's why her title, Specialist Master. I'm not sure, but she has 12 years of AWS billing and account management experience across the public sector and commercial, and has recently moved to Deloitte in order to bring FinOps to federal, state, and local governments. When not parsing through the curve file, and yes, she enjoys the curve file because she's a billing geek, she spends her time with her animals in Northern Virginia. Please join me in welcoming Marit Hughes to the show. Marit, thanks for joining me.
John, thank you for having me. It's been a journey in the time we've known each other.
Yes, in fact, we met when I was at AWS. Then you went to another company, and then I contacted you, and we reached out there, and then you helped me with another thing for billing. And in fact, you're my go-to specialist around AWS billing. In fact, I don't reach out to AWS for it because I know you know the answer and can easily explain it to me.
I try. Every once in a while, I hit a thing where my answer is, let me back into that for you to get to some of those finer, grittier details on the areas I don't live in constantly. But yeah, it's been 12 years back from before any of these resources that we have now existed. It was actually predated the cost and usage report and predated the detailed billing with resources and tags file. It was just the cost allocation report when I started. So it has been a lot of learning along the way.
Back then when you were downloading it into spreadsheets, maybe?
Yes, I used to, for those of you who have lived in a reselling world or a world where you wanted to undo RI sharing, way back in the day, I did that via hand in Excel. And when some of the tools that are now really popular are given came out, I still had to undo it by hand for I think another year before the tools started to integrate those types of things into their offering.
So, Marit, normally I give everybody a little bit of a chance to give an introduction, but I think we've actually dived into some of your background and your expertise. I'd like to dive into our topic. What our topic today is FinOps culture. If security is job 0, then FinOps is job 0.5. But while that's our topic, I got to read you something, and it's happens to be here in this Cloud FinOps second edition book. Sorry.
I think you might find that quote in there. I think you'll find that quote in there.
Exactly. But I think the really cool part, first of all, this is not even, it's like page 1, like pre-Roman numeral 1. It says, security is job 0. FinOps is job 0.5. Just as security is everyone's job, so too is FinOps. The second edition of the Cloud FinOps books provides a recipe for FinOps success. It's by Marit Hughes, Deloitte. Interesting that you were. By the way, I have to tell everybody you're the first one ahead of commerce platforms at Google Cloud, the first one ahead of VP Core Commerce at Microsoft, and Cloud Financial Management at Citi. So I think your quote has really hit home with everybody.
I also think that it's the shortest of the quotes, so it made a really nice intro. And it really got even the shortest bio to go behind it. JR, who's one of the authors, heard me say that in as an offhand comment a little bit, and it was about whose responsibility is establishing a FinOps culture. And when should that start? And that was really what the conversation was when should you start incorporating FinOps? And at the time I said it as a little bit of an aside. It's something that I've said many times before, though, which is security is 100% number one first priority, right? Particularly in the government. Depending on the agency, it might have every single person who resides in the US information about their lives, right? The Social Security Administration, the Census Bureau, whoever, that information is there. Security absolutely has to be job 0. But establishing those components of how you approach solving your technical problems needs to include FinOps right there behind it. Because a lot of times people use FinOps as a shorthand for cloud financial management. And the really cloud financial management is, are you getting things for the cheapest price possible, right? Are you buying your RIs? Are you negotiating your programs with your CSPs? And to me, FinOps is really from the moment of application ideation. I am going to build a tool that does X. I am going to build a SaaS that does Y. You need to be putting into that thought process, what is my priorities here on cost performance trade-off, right? Because you might have two very equal capabilities or methodologies you could use to architect a solution, and one costs 20% more. Now, it may be that it's 20% more because it is that extra 9 worth of reliability. Instead of 4 nines, it gives you 5 nines. Take that moment to go, does this application really need 5 nines worth? We all go to the store and go, oh, I like that shirt, but not for $150, I don't. Right? And so it needs to be the same thing for your application design, right? And maybe you need that 5 nines for your production environment. But your testing and staging environment, well, your staging should be match your prod, but your testing environment, maybe you only need 1 9. So save that money where you can, particularly if you are working in an environment that's come out of on-premises, right? They're not born in the cloud. Really stopping and thinking, like, is this something we could handle with microservices? Is this something better suited for containers? Is this something that we need to, for legislative reasons, regulatory reasons, use on-premises models for? Then that's fine, but you had to have taken that moment to thought and consider and really put that into your culture so that everyone is asking those questions to be able to really spread it and not just have it be, well, the CFO's office says or the FinOps team says. It needs to be intrinsic.
All right, let me dive into a little bit about, you indicated like if I go to like containers or serverless or however I want to do some things, you're suggesting that FinOps should play a role immediately in like, okay, this will be a cost savings versus normally it's thought like, can I secure this serverless environment? Can I secure my container environment? Yes, great. How can I do it in an efficient way that's cost effective? Or you're saying, let's look at this first from a standpoint that, where you want to go to the containers for cost effective. Now, how can we secure this?
So security, job zero, 100% security is there, right? But once you're past okay, we understand we've got to have these firewalls, we got to have these NAT gateways, whatever security mechanisms that you're putting in place, there is still that, for example, how over-provisioned do we need to be, right? Can we run this on Graviton on a 2XL? Our average, we think, right, because it's ideation stage, we think on a 2XL with Graviton, we're going to be running like 65, 70% as peak. And, 2 generations ago, that is too high. You might run into performance issues. But hey, maybe with modern generations in Graviton, we can do this lower size. Or is your application so critical that you need to be over provisioned because you literally cannot afford a second of lag caused by CPU overages, right? And having these really critical thought discussions at the architecture and design phase. Because if you are just looking at how to save money on the cloud, right? We have this cloud bill, how do we save money on it? That's retrospective, right? Culture needs to be from beginning to end. And hey, sometimes you're going to have an engineering team that says, you know what? To do this, I really do need the biggest, bestest, over-provisioned everything. Sometimes your engineering team's like, hey, we can do it with less. And somebody who actually knows what the contract says, great, we can do it with less. Will we be able to meet this contractual requirement? Right? That's about downtime, about ability to recover, about DR. It's going to be part of how you do your multi-AZ versus global deploy, right? And figuring all of those components out. And it's not that the cheapest wins. It is 100% not that the cheapest wins. It's doing that balance of fast, good, or cheap, pick two. And the answer is not pick two. It's find the spot in the middle of that triangle that balances all of those needs for what you need to do.
First, I like that you said security job zero, right? And
Yep.
instead of FinOps being 1, it's like 0.5. It's very critical to the security part, right? You take care of the security aspect, and then your next step is talking about FinOps. And also, it's not about cost savings. It's actually about what is the business driven decision for your performance, to meet your SLA, to meet your guidelines, to meet all those things. Yeah, cost does play a factor in it, but it's not the primary thing. It's really what are some of those guidelines. But one of the things that I find interesting about, FinOps is that it's a cultural practice. It's something that we should have been doing all along, whether it's in the cloud or in the business or moving forward to that. But it's only become really huge and visible now that cloud is like an on demand, and people are seeing that the bill is now trickling down to the developers, the hands-on engineers that are doing some of the work and provisioning. And then the finance is like, oh my God, my bill is 3 times as much and I can't forecast this.
Well, and I think that that's actually the real distinction. It's not that the billing data has made it to the engineers. It's that for a long time, the cloud bill didn't register on the radar. One of the reasons I learned as much as I did about the true weeds of AWS billing was because I was just obsessed with understanding how they arrived at $100.12, right? Because I had to be able to explain it to a government contracting officer who still thought the clouds were the puffy things in the sky. And as I pushed back on AWS a lot back then, I was frequently told, you're the only one complaining. You're the only one complaining. This isn't a problem. And I kept saying, well, then I'm the only one looking. And 2 years later, AWS got up on stage at reInvent and the Partner Summit and went, oh, people complain that our RI application method is just willy-nilly, which was a phrase I had used to them to describe it, right? And what it really was is that bill was hitting more and more people's radar. It was very easy to ignore, right? Just like your subscription to Netflix, right? It's $19.99 on your credit card. You don't even see it. And as cloud bills got larger and hit more companies, all of a sudden CFOs started to go, oh, this $3,000, even $10,000 bill is not a needle mover in my organization. Now that bill's $300,000, it's a needle mover, right? And then they start to hit 3 million. And now it is the needle. And so finance started to get involved. And I say this as a former finance accounting person now who divides the line between tech and finance and accounting. Is there just how can we make this number more consistent and let me predict it and make it go down, right? They're not really concerned in the details of how that happens. And so they're going to push for the cheapest, just bring my bill down. But I think that if we really do take the time to establish that culture that says everyone cares and has chosen from the beginning to make sure that we did a proper balancing of our needs, because we all do, right? We do it when we go to the grocery store. Why can't we do it with our cloud bill? To make sure that throughout our culture, this is something that we care about versus, oh, that finance people are over here screaming that we need to bring our bill down. It puts too much blame on finance and not enough on the people who decided to lift and shift, right? And lift and shift is the purest sign of a lack of FinOps culture that I've ever seen in my life. And people continue to do it, even though we're 10 years into lift and shift is not the way to go. And anytime I hear that somebody is doing lift and shift, the first question I ask is, do they understand that it will be more expensive than being on premises?
Oh, so many topics, so many comments on lift and shift. I don't know if we have a long enough show for this. I don't
think so, and I think it's been beaten to death. So I don't know that we need to go through there, but it is part of that cultural. What's your cultural practice? And if your cultural practice, the lift and shift is even a regular option, right? It is every time you're migrating something to the cloud from on-prem. If lift and shift gets mentioned with a question mark every time, you don't have that culture because it means that that's a viable option for you. Now, I did hear of a client who had a mandatory regulatory compliance to lift and shift a particular application because their contract included certain specs and all of this stuff that could be newer, better, faster, cheaper, but the contract said X, Y, Z, and they had to do it, even though it was going to be more expensive. And that's something we run into a lot in public sector is regulatory compliance. Some of them make sense, right? Archive rules, things like that. Others sound good in theory, but no one thought about the consequence. We were just a week ago at the Washington, D.C. FinOps Community Day, and had a wonderful presentation. It was a panel of government employees who have been working to bring FinOps into federal. And one of them brought up the story about how a executive order came out. So they turned on all of this logging in their AWS environment, and it sent their bill through the roof because they were logging. If it could be logged, they just turned it all
logged.
on,
Yep.
all of it, all the time. And because that agency has put things into place to start alerting when they start seeing things outside of their norm, it immediately caught the radar. Went back to security and went, we get that there's a regulatory compliance here. Did you just go all in? Because that was the easiest way to ensure compliance. Because security has to take part in FinOps. They may be job zero, but they're not exempt from FinOps, right? And go back and say, all right,
what's needed, what's required, yeah. what is viable that's required out of these logs, and what all the logs needed.
And do we need them all? Do we need them at this frequency? Yep. Does Splunk or Datadog or whoever need to be accessing all of these logs all of the time? No. Let's turn that off. And because they have established FinOps in a large portion and they've installed some process and some alerting, they were able to start pushing that culture backwards. But if it had been truly embedded culturally, before logging was turned on, there would have been a question asked, how much is this going to cost us? And do the people who are going to get the alerts know about it? Because sometimes you have to turn it on, right? That's how regulations work. You got to do it whether you want to or not, or whether you can afford to or not. But with that advanced warning, that advanced consideration, you can start making plans of how to get more funding or how to shift funding or whatever it is you need to do to make sure that you can meet your regulatory rules and not go broke in the process.
So everybody, we are talking with Marit Hughes. She's a specialist master, and our topic today, if security is job zero, then FinOps is 0.5. Marit, before we dive a little bit deeper on it, we're talking about FinOps, and in front of me, I have the Cloud FinOps book. By the way, Marit's quoted on the very first page, top line. Everybody, you should check it out. Second edition. I'll put a link in the description below. Get the book. There's a lot of information. In fact, I think it's 2 times thicker than the first edition. I didn't measure it in exact.
Hey, this looks like a good place to jump in and talk about today's sponsor, Veeam. How would you like to own, control, and protect your data in the cloud? Are you using Salesforce? Veeam has you covered with Veeam Backup for Salesforce, backing up your Salesforce data effortlessly, whether it's on-premise or in the cloud. Honestly, why wouldn't you back up your most critical CRM data from loss or corruption? Now imagine your sales team coming in and not be able to recover all their information, their notes, their pipeline, because it's the one thing you didn't think you needed to back up. How about doing it effortlessly with Veeam Backup for Salesforce? While there are 9 reasons that you should back up your Salesforce data, how about just 2, data loss and data corruption? Veeam Backup for Salesforce eliminates the risk of you losing your data and metadata due to human error, integration, or other Salesforce data loss scenarios. Check out Veeam Backup for Salesforce today. Now, how about we get you back to that podcast?
I want to jump into a couple of things, Marit. We're talking FinOps. Can
Absolutely.
You distinct the difference between Cloud FinOps and FinOps? Like, why the title difference?
Honestly, I would say FinOps is actually a cloud-born, cloud-native concept, right? It's very much analogous to DevOps, which again, kind of in the cloud, and we've taken those lessons learned and moved them into on-premises. The FinOps Foundation had one of their Women in Tech events with the leads from a couple of large commercial entities who talked about they started with FinOps in their cloud and they're now moving that to their on-premises environments, right? What do we really need? Because on-premises was very much buy for whatever you think you might need in the next 3 years. We're going to CapEx that baby. And hey, if we overbuy, that's better than underbuying. And hey, we're already paying for the AC and the utility. Great, just we're good. And they're really starting to push that. Hey, if you don't need it, turn it off. If just because you can run it on a 4XL, but you could also run it on a small, right? Why don't you go ahead and downsize that, right? And so they're starting to take it there. Could they have just called it FinOps originally? Sure, but when they put out the first edition, nobody really knew what FinOps was, whether it was cloud or on premises, right? So they, put the cloud in there to hit the search algorithm, and it stuck. But I think that it really doesn't matter. The reality is most of us are using a variation of FinOps in our everyday lives, and we're not applying it to our cloud bill, right? We're applying it to our monthly budget. We're applying it to our grocery bill. We're applying it to our home remodeling, decorating ideas, right? It's a cost benefit analysis of, for this amount of money, I get X. Do I need it? Is it worth it? Can I afford it? Yes or no? The nice thing, though, about the cloud is it is much easier to purge your cloud environment than it is to purge your house.
Or your data center. So.
Yeah, or your data center, right? You can run a few scripts and clean out your cloud environment, but sadly, the house and the data center takes moving equipment and recycling trips and dump runs.
Oh my God, I think I'm going to quote that, Marit. It's going to be in, I can't say my next book because I didn't do a first book, but I think I might have to quote it. Marit, one of the important things with FinOps is that it's not about cost savings, right? Reduction. Yeah. It's actually about making money, right? That's exactly what I've kind of driven through in a lot of the culture. It's on the FinOps website. Is most people think FinOps is about reducing costs, right sizing, cost optimization. What's your feeling here?
I would say that all of those things are components of FinOps, right? Because you do want to do those things.
Yep.
But the fundamental truth is all of those things are retrospective. They're cleanup, right? Turn off the things you're not using, pay, buy your RIs, buy your savings plans for spend you're already doing. I think if you're truly culturally engaged in FinOps and not just ticking the box that says, we have FinOps, check, you really
we bought in and now we have it. Here's the logo.
Yes, exactly. You really have taken it to your architecture level. You've taken it to your development level. You have kind of checks and balances to make sure that you're doing what you're doing, just like you would on your development pipeline for your DevOps and your DevSecOps and your this ops and, before your releases. That's all in there. But one thing I wanted to kind of stop you on, and I probably should have started with that, is you had said this is all about making money. And that's true for commercial SaaS enterprises.
I like the clarity.
Because if it's a commercial SaaS enterprise, the application you're building is a software as a service that is generating revenue. If you are a retail and your cloud environment is hosting your website, it's making money. If you're a government agency collecting census data, it's not making you money, right?
Very
if
true.
You're a government agency that is processing visa applications that technically have a fee assigned to them, right? People pay for their fees, their visas, but the amount of money they're taking in, like, they still took that money in when they were processing actual paper, right?
Yeah.
So those things aren't always actively making money. In some even kind of traditional businesses, cloud is part of their cost of doing business, but it's not in and of itself generating revenue for them, right? So it's tempting, particularly unit economics is a tempting thing. Like, what is our cost per client, our cost per customer? Those things are actually relevant in government too. If you're the VA, if you're the CDC, the cost per individual consumer is a metric, but it's not a revenue-based metric.
Okay, so two things came out of that. I want to understand more about the unit economics, and I'm sure our audience wants to dive into it. But do you feel that Cloud FinOps, I'm just going to call it FinOps because I
Just
feel
call
like
it
I'm
FinOps,
just
yeah.
using another term. But do you feel that the entire methodology and culture and everything that's tied around FinOps applies to government, or now we have a separate variation of it?
It 100% all applies. It's just in a slightly different flavor, right? Slightly different motivators for some of the personas. And we have extra personas particularly in federal, than you would typically find in a commercial enterprise. The drivers of resistance are a little different in government, but very similar to large scale, old school enterprise. And I think the distinction where the distinction needs to lie is less between federal and commercial and more kind of cloud native industries. The challenges Instacart has with their cloud bill is going to be very, very different than some bank that started 200 years ago, right? It's a lot of just what your overall culture is in your organization and now how that applies to your cloud. But yeah, no, there's the playbooks, the steps are a little different, but the culture elements and the things you need to consider all the same regardless.
How big how big do you feel that FinOps is in government now, and how big do you think it's going to get in the importance of it in the next, say, and I know government moves slow, so we'll just say year to 5 years?
So what's interesting about how cloud technology is deployed in the government is the vast majority of cloud technology is being deployed in let's take one agency as an example. Agency X, there's not just government employees there, and there's not just one government contractor. There are 10 different government contractors all working on probably a total of 30 different applications, some of which are legacy applications, some of which are, net new things being built, and trying to get cohesion across all of those parties while still keeping them in compliance with their contracts, right? Because their contracts contain requirements that may have been written 4 years ago. They may be supporting an application that was built 8 years ago, and it needs to continue to be supported because it's providing needed services to citizens. But also what we run into a lot in the government space is OCI, and I do not mean Oracle Cloud. I mean organizational conflict of interest. So for example, if I were to get oversight of the entire cloud bill for an agency that I was working for, or an agency I was supporting, that would give me insight into what my competitors are doing in their environment. And that, in most cases, would exclude my firm from bidding on any work related to the cloud for that agency. Now, there are firewalls and stuff you can put up to help reduce that, but it's very hard to build a culture with that many disparate parties that have conflicting motivations, conflicting contracts that don't even align with each other, which doesn't mean it can't be done. And that's why the work that Melvin and Laura are doing at GSA and DOE, OPM's involved as well, is so critical, because the government has to be the one starting to push this culture. As contractors, our responsibility is to support it for things that are under our control, right? For our applications, make sure our development process includes a FinOps culture. What's really nice here is our FinOps offering has been stood up by our migrations lead. So all of our migrations, just by kind of almost by definition of having the same sponsor, it's already being built in so that everything we're doing on that side, from that, there's no lift and shift happening unless the contract says it has to, right? is implementing that throughout the process. And I have no doubt that others are doing it because the government's starting to squeeze down on how much they'll fund. So you've got to be very aggressive with keeping things tight in order to make sure you're funded, because in commercial, they can always shift money around to give you more. And in the government, there's probably a congressional regulation that says somewhere we can't take money that we didn't use to buy tickets to reInvent. You can't use that money to spin up an extra server.
Well, the more and more that I learn about government, the more I'm educated, right? I was down at the FinOps Roadshow in DC last week, and hearing all of our guests, our speakers, and understanding the processes and just listening to people ask questions, I'm like, wow, this is definitely not something in the commercial aspect. I want to jump back to...
Did you feel a little bit like you fell in a bowl of alphabet soup?
Oh, the acronyms that were happening and being thrown around that people, I'm like, wait, what is that? And I had to look up certain ones, and they're like, oh, this one, the DOD, the DOJ, this. I'm like, what is that? Wait, I've never heard it. Oh, I didn't have enough acronyms. I probably had too many acronyms when I left, and I didn't understand half of them.
Get in line. There's a lot of people like that. It was very interesting to me. I ran into several people I knew at that event who were commercial, who had come to that event because it was local. And more than one of them admitted that they had not looked at the agenda, so hadn't realized how government heavy it was going to be. And without fail, every single last one of the purely commercial people said, I had no idea this much went into it. And it is a different world because of the regulatory issues mostly, but not entirely. Strangely, I find those rules, I can't say I find them freeing because it would be fundamentally untrue, but it is nice to have. So in commercial, kind of anyone can make anything happen. You're restricted to the internal politics of your environment, of your company. Internal politics still play a big role in government, far more at the agency level. Day-to-day operations, internal politics are far more important than national politics, right? You're arguing with your CIO. It does not matter whether he's a Republican or a Democrat. It's really because, you just disagree on things. But some of these policies can be very restrictive, but they also give you boundaries, right? This is where my domain ends. And would I like it to expand further? Sure, but at least I know where it ends. So that part can sometimes be a little bit of a stress relief because you're like, I don't have to be responsible for it all. I can only control my area. But it does make implementing FinOps a little bit more difficult because of where those boundaries lie. And that's why it's so important to have government sponsors, government employee sponsors of putting FinOps into their agencies, into their procurements, into how they manage their day-to-day spend.
Marit, can you help me understand the unit metrics and how it applies to FinOps, and what are some of the differences between the commercial and then the government for unit metrics? I know you were talking about it, but I'm very intrigued on some of the difference, if you're able to help me out.
Yeah, so typically when we talk about unit cost in a commercial world, it really is your cost per customer, right? That's really kind of your cloud cost versus your revenue. And how you slice and dice what constitutes revenue, what constitutes cloud cost, that varies, but the formula is effectively the same. In government, it really depends on what that agency is doing and what that application is doing. So if it's the DoD, is it cost per soldier? Is it cost per airman? Is it cost for, is it just for the Marines? Is it just for the Air Force? Is it for all of them? Is it just for their dependents, right? So finding that one true metric isn't quite the same because there's not revenue associated with it, right? So what's going to be your top line denominator or your numerator? It's very difficult. And you certainly can't have one that goes across agencies, because how would you compare the Department of Interior or the National Park Service to the Department of Defense, right? You use identical metrics for things like unit cost. You can use them for a whole host of have identical metrics for a whole host of other things. What percentage of your environment is tagged, right? All of that is very static. But determining that unit cost, you really have to understand what the application is doing. And I think we're going to find more and more at the government that it's not going to be cloud environment, it's going to be cloud application. Because one single agency can be doing so many different types of work, and again, not tied to revenue. That how do you measure how effective something is? And it will make creating benchmarks cross-agency very difficult, right? When we look at the state of FinOps, right, they had all those statistics. Where are you at this? Where are you at that? Are you run, walk, crawl? And I think what we're going to find is there's not enough commonality on some metrics to even do a federal agency against agency benchmark. Other metrics, 100%, you could even put them up against commercial. But those ones along the lines of unit economics will be very, very difficult because there is no one true numerator and no one true denominator. So it will be difficult to really, and I know I've said this again, but it's going to be very difficult to find this one number that will be you have reached nirvana of FinOps.
But that doesn't apply to, so I'm a commercial company, right? And I want to do the unit economics around FinOps. Isn't it kind of thinking about like that commercial company as a different agency, and I want to apply that to unit economics for this agency, for the Department of Defense or Department of Interior or the parks, right? Each one will have their own separate unit economics. Isn't that acceptable? And we're all doing, I mean, I assume they would implement it at their own pace and their own level because they're separate groups or separate entities.
Yes, but I think the difference is Instacart could probably measure up against DoorDash, against Grubhub, right? So, and maybe even
there's
potentially
no
against
in the
Uber,
government,
right? So, but trying to find like who is the competitor to NIH? I mean, I guess maybe CDC, but not really, right? And so trying to determine how efficient you are based off of external measurements is, I think, what's going to be very difficult in government. Not impossible. I think that we're going to find, again, there's some metrics that we will be able to do across government, right? What percentage of your workload is being run with microservices? What percentage of your workload is tagged? What percentage of your environment is scheduled to turn off? What's your return to like your time between failure, right? There's all sorts of metrics on your environment, but those unit economics ones, your cost per customer, those are going to be hard because a lot of agencies are serving multiple types using very different resources. And I think the best option, and this is an off-the-cuff thought that I've not critically thought through, so nobody hold this against me in 3 years. I think what it's going to be is start within an agency and go, okay, this particular application has a cost per soldier, for example, of $18, but this other application has a cost per soldier of $3. Now, what they're doing, why it's so complex, may be valid, may not be. But I think as we start looking at unit economics in the government, it's probably going to be different applications within an agency measured against each other and not an agency to agency comparison. And I mean, God, I hope I'm wrong and we can get to agency, but I don't think that that's anywhere in our near future.
I thought you were going to say in our lifetime. I'm like, wow.
Well, I mean,
wait,
how healthy are you?
I'm a healthy male adult, so I should be all right.
I don't know. Let's check with those insurance actuaries. They may have different opinions. But yeah, it's hard saying. What's funny is the government gets a reputation for moving slowly, and sometimes they do. But one of the reasons they move slowly is because of regulations that force them to. Other times, it's just resistance to change, which has plagues commercial as well. I just think even multinational companies that are in multiple areas, Amazon themselves, for example, right? They have a retail business. I got a thing today that they're starting to do telemedicine type of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I knew they were starting prescriptions, but apparently I can email them and tell them that I have a painful shoulder and they can give me a prescription. I don't know. Right? As they start to measure their cost per customer between those different business units that are not an analogous, I'm not going to say that correctly, so I'm going to choose a different word, that are not parallel, right? So your healthcare, you can't measure your healthcare business cost per customer versus your AWS versus your Amazon retail cost per customer. I think that that's probably a closer comparison to the struggles government's going to have with unit economics than comparing single industry players. Because even Uber with Uber and Uber Eats, you know what it still is? Car share. With one person driving around in their own car, it's just sometimes they're driving around food, sometimes they're driving around people. That is a very similar industry versus comparing if Uber also owned I don't even know what business. Let's say if Uber also owned an urgent care. You can't compare those.
That would be interesting.
They're just acting. You know what they're doing? They're trying. If they do that, it's because they know how expensive ambulances are, and they're trying to take in that business, right? How many people has Uber taken to an actual hospital because ambulances are too expensive, right? So,
I bet you there's some stats behind that.
I am sure there are, and I'm sure there's some Uber driver horror stories.
I need to Google that.
But I think that it's those really kind of large scale enterprises that are in very diverse business areas. I mean, Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. How do you compare a newspaper to Amazon, right? And rumor has it he's trying to buy the Washington Commanders. And how do you compare a newspaper to a football team, right? Those are the problems of the agencies, not comparing Nike to Adidas cloud costs.
Very true. Very true. Marit, I've got two more questions before we have to wrap it up. One of them we talked about, and I want to reiterate the story and use it as an example, but it's going to be retrospect for cost savings and optimization, commercial versus government. So I'm going to give you a little heads up that we're going to ask that question. You know which one, I hope you know which one we're talking about with the workspaces.
I think we'll, workspaces. Okay.
Yeah, we were having that discussion in person and talking about it. This first one, I really want to understand. So implementing FinOps, I know it should be done or mainly done upfront, right? But all these companies exist and now they want to implement it. Can I implement FinOps now? And what does it look like from actually getting started from like the first time implementation or an existing? Because I'm assuming I've got all these applications versus I've got all these new applications and I can implement FinOps from the start.
I think when you have an already existing environment that's sizable, built out, whatever, and now you're starting to say, hey, we need to take a cultural approach to this and not just negotiate our price down with AWS. It is going to take engaged stakeholders from a bunch of areas. In my opinion, the most important stakeholders to get engaged are on the technical and engineering side, because they're the ones who actually have the know-how, the ability to determine, and the ability to execute things like, what if we upgrade to Graviton? Oh, we're upgrading to Graviton, but we're sitting on C4s, and a C7G means I could probably downsize 2 sizes. You don't want that decision in the hands of finance.
Finance would say turn it all off. Or cut it in half.
Finance might say turn it all off, or finance might say, well, then just upgrade to Graviton. Well, but is the workload compatible? Yep. Maybe the workload needs an Intel chip. Great. Needs an Intel chip. Could we still go up to a C6i and still save, 10%? But going from a T3 large to a T3 medium is only going to save you this much per month. So it might not be worth the engineering time. But you need those engaged stakeholders who really want to push efficiency. And that efficiency doesn't just come with a dollar sign. It comes with a little green leaf too. Because as you downscale, as you modernize and get things more performant, you are getting more for less using less energy.
Yep.
So if I can go from a C4 4XL to a C7G XL, I've saved money, I've saved the environment, and hopefully it comes back to me in my performance review and bonus. So please, if you are doing these large initiatives, be sure to track them. You are not going to get all the savings as a bonus. I wish I just found about $150,000 worth of waste in one category. This is what I thought you were going to ask about, not not workspaces, that you were going to ask about EBS. I will not get a penny of that specific money in my bonus. So track it so that you can say at the end of the year, I saved $1 million. Please do not expect to get a $500,000 bonus as a result, but do track it. So you're going to need them. If it is just finance, slamming on save money, save money, save money, you're going to get resentment. So it is building that culture of, hey, we're all trying to achieve this multitude of goals, a secure, stable, scalable environment that uses less energy and costs less money. Finance can focus on negotiating EDPs and buying savings plans and RIs, but they still have to talk to engineering, because if engineering's about to resize and move their RDS to Graviton, there's no savings plans for RDS. So please, dear finance, do not buy your RIs without confirming with engineering those environments are staying up.
Hey, everybody. FinOps, financial and operations, working together, a team collaboration, and getting all the stakeholders. It's all coming together now.
Yes, exactly. I've long said that the main differences between on-premises and the cloud was in on-premises, engineering and procurement, finance, whoever would talk every 3 years.
Yep.
And in the cloud, somebody's like, yeah, they've got to talk yearly. I was like, what are you talking about? They need to
Yearly,
talk at least
daily.
monthly. Yeah, at least monthly. Daily is, for most organizations, not all of them should be talking daily, but there should be they should be a pinned chat on your Slack channel, right? This is a person I talk often enough. They should get pinned to the top.
They're at the top of my DMs. I get notified every time they message me, just because it's finance or just because it's technical, and I lean on them.
Well, just because it's important, right? Yep. So because you do need that support. You don't want to buy the wrong RI, because then you're not saving money. And you do need to know because you're building your budget for next year or your forecast for next year. In the government, they have to forecast out 3 years in advance. How many of you can estimate your cloud bill for 2 years from now? And the government has to, because that has to go to Congress.
I think 2 months from now is difficult.
Yeah, exactly. So, building that is, even when you're already deployed, you've got to start with building those relationships. I'm in a working group right now for the FinOps Foundation on building trust, right? And working together, because you do have to build trust, because these are not teams that have a history of working together. There's negative stereotypes on both sides. Finance people only care about numbers in black and white, and then tech people only, they don't have no social skills, right? And the reality is, some of the most eloquent people I've ever talked to are tech workers, are developers in particular, because developers, the problem solving skills and the way you have to effectively write your code is a communication method. So they just have to translate it into English that regular people understand. and I say this as one of the regular people, but they're great communicators. It's just that you
don't speak in JSON or YAML or Python?
I'll tell you, I can read JSON, but I cannot write JSON. Just like
ChatGPT
I can read Italian, but I can't speak it. I can't write Italian. So It's a challenge, but it can absolutely be done and should be done. Don't let the fact you haven't started with FinOps stop you from implementing it. Just please don't turn it into a way to beat up engineers. It's not helping
Nice.
anyone.
Marit, my last question is
Yes.
really talking about cost savings and right sizing.
Mhm.
You and I were talking about this, and from a commercial perspective, it's very easy for us to do and just turn it off. But in a government perspective, you gave me an insight on why it's not easy. So I'm going to set everybody up. I work, an example. I work for a commercial company, and I have 100 developers that are using workspaces, but they're only using them for 15 days out of the month. We're going to say a month is 30 days. We'll just narrow down some numbers, right?
Yeah.
And we don't need them for the other 15 days, or they're not using them for the next 6 months. Well, we turn them off. We don't need them. Shut them down, get rid of them, and we'll re-provision them. Easy with commercial, right, Marit?
Correct. Generally
Okay.
speaking, it's easy with commercial.
Well,
Yes.
I'm summarizing, paraphrasing.
Yeah.
I'll turn it off. We'll deploy it, everything. But you help me understand the government. Will you explain to everybody some of the processes, some of the thoughts and things that go behind the scenes on why we can't turn off, terminate, or get rid of those workspaces for the next 6 months and just turn them back on or provision them out?
Yep. So a colleague of mine went through an effort to try and optimize workspaces. They had hundreds of workspaces, some of which had not been logged into. And he couldn't just say, let's turn them off. More accurately, he said, what we could do is turn them off, but, and what that but is all of these things, right, whether it's a workspace, whether it's a server, have to go through an approval process. And that approval process is not, email Susan. That approval process probably included 4 layers of security, a description of what you were going to run on that workspace, and a whole bunch of things. And it probably took you somewhere between 2 to 6 months to get permission for that workspace. Oh, and it came in while you were out on FMLA, right? Can't turn it off because when they're ready to use it again, they have to go through that whole process all over again. And if they need it now, they won't be able to deliver it. Right? So because it is not we have a process, but you need an exception, go have your boss talk to Susan. She'll get it launched for you today. It's you need it today. I'm so sorry. We shut it off because you hadn't used it in 3 months is not something that flies because there is no mechanism to do a fast restore for a lot of those things. And it's something that kind of the normies, I don't know, struggle with a lot because they're like, well, that just seems like waste. The government shouldn't be wasting that money. But so many of these rules and regulations were put in to prevent fraud in other areas. And how do you balance all of those things, right? They had to go through those security checks to make sure that they weren't going to put your social security information on the net, right? Like they have to go through all of these checks and then get the permission and have the funding. And that funding is specifically for that type of workload. You can't take it from workspaces and say, I'm going to go store more in S3 or something with it. Sometimes you can, but rarely. And those operational hurdles are non-negotiable. There is no just have the CEO say yes. And it really makes it difficult in some cases to take that shut it off approach. So my colleague went through a whole, what is the usage consumption for monthly versus auto stop? Hot tip, somewhere depending on your sizing, between 80 and 90 hours per month is the break-even point on monthly versus auto stop. And anybody who was using less than that threshold got converted to auto stop. So that at the very least, if they weren't using it, you weren't paying the monthly fee. And in fact, on a different client, I recently used the reverse. They had everything on auto stop, but a fair number of them were being used 40 hours a week every week. I was like, hey, you need to go find out
There was
which
no
are which.
cost savings there. Yeah.
Yeah, you're paying more, right? So,
Yep.
Go figure out which ones are which. And if they're 40 hours a week every week, convert them to monthly, right? So it can go both ways, but it can be, sometimes those hurdles in government are frustrating, as somebody who's trying to help them as a taxpayer. But as you start to understand those operational hurdles, the regulatory hurdles, right? Just like, hey, turn on all the logging, please. They are there for a reason, and whether that reason is good, bad, has good intentions, bad outcomes, right? It doesn't really matter. It's a regulation, and all we can do is help find the most cost-efficient method to keep everyone compliant.
But Marit, didn't we got this workspace, and I know we're almost out of time, but I'm very curious. We got this workspace, and developer's not using it, whatever, he's not, and I just stop it, right? Mm-hmm. And they can't submit a ticket to just turn it back on because it's already been provisioned. I already went through all the approvals, but it's just sitting there stopped. They can't submit a ticket, and I can't just go click start.
So auto stop is fine. It's the deleting of them, right? So because that's what we did. We converted them from monthly to auto stop. And then they just sign in and it restarts.
Yep. Yeah, it takes about 90 seconds to come back online.
That
it's
is
just
fine.
In a suspended state. Okay.
It's the you have 300 of them and 100 of them have not been logged into for 6 months.
Yeah.
You can't just blanket delete those. You can put together a list. You can start approaching people. Are they still here? Do you still need this? And you can go through that much longer process. Yeah. But in commercial, you can kind of be like, all right, new rule. If your workspace hasn't been used in 3 months, goodbye.
Gone.
and in government, you can't be as loose and fast as that because of the hurdles to get it back. So instead you go, all right, well, we'll convert you to auto stop for now, and then begin the process of saying, hey, these 6 instances, workspaces belong to people who are no longer here or have changed roles, so don't need them. Let's send them an email to confirm. Right. And then, the next 20 are, we got approval to delete, right? But those things can take weeks and months to work through, but you can get your immediate short-term savings by just saying, okay, well, we can't turn them off, but we can convert them to auto stop if they haven't been logged into, so that you can try and at least stem that waste. Wow. And again, a little bit greener if they're at least stopped.
Very true. Very true. And auto stop will save some of those as long as it's cost effective as well. There's always that fine balance. Marit, thank you so much for joining me. This has been really insightful. Our topic today has been if security is job 0, FinOps is job 0.5. Marit, thank you so much for joining me.
Jon, thank you for having me. And I'm sure our paths will continue to cross at conferences, if nowhere else.
Oh, yes, and definitely. So everybody, Marit Hughes, Specialist Master, and we were talking really specifically about Cloud FinOps, however you want to do it, and some of the in-depth knowledge that she has, not only around the cost, but the government sector. Everybody, my name's Jon Myer. You've been watching the Jon Myer Podcast. Don't forget to hit that like, subscribe, and notify, because guess what? As always, we're out of here.